Welcome into the Big City Sports Podcast. We have another episode coming up. The New York Islanders have advanced, I should say. They're playing the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Eastern Conference Finals. It should be a good one. These two teams match up really well. They defeated the Boston Bruins in 6 games, so we're going to be able to recap that series and preview what's to come here against the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the Brooklyn Nets have been playing some solid basketball, even without James Harden and Jeff Green. We'll get into that in a little bit too. But before all things, Swig, how you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to talk about the playoffs a little bit more. We're getting deeper and deeper here with the two teams we're about to cover, and it's going to be an interesting episode. Just talking about the New York teams I don't like in two different sports. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, probably a little bit shorter on that front, but not because we don't necessarily care for them, but it's because, I mean, there's nothing really to say about the same things we've been going on and on. So looking at the New York Islanders, this is a hockey team that we've talked about a lot. Their defensive structure is usually the way they win games. They usually play a possession style. Barry Trotz, the way he's implemented that. They've been getting some goal scoring in this series as well. Now, it could be due to the shoddy / injuries to Tuukka Rask that has briefly been noted by head coach Bruce Cassidy. I think Tuukka was a little bit banged up here these last few games, but either way, the Islanders are advanced and they're looking pretty good.
Well, first of all, I have no problem admitting that I definitely don't care for these teams, but we still got to cover them. So there's no doubt, though, the Islanders have now advanced to the NHL's Final Four, Conference Final, whatever you want to call it this year, with the teams being realigned here in the semifinal round. But they advanced past the Bruins in 6 games in a physical series that was pretty tightly contested throughout. Definitely not short of emotions, physicality, that grind out kind of old-fashioned hockey in this series. It was definitely entertaining. We saw some electric crowds, especially at the shithole that the Islanders call home in Nassau. But the energy was just unrivaled, and it really provided the backdrop for an awesome series, awesome atmosphere. And the Islanders were able to pull it out, winning the last 3 games, similar to the Pittsburgh series, and advancing in 6.
Yeah, it was a lot of good things happening for this Islanders team. Head coach Barry Trotz went back to Semyon Varlamov. We talked about that he went into this series. He had Sorokin playing well. He made the switch to go back to his veteran goaltender there in Semyon Varlamov, and he played fantastic down the stretch for this team. I know the defense usually helps out in front, but Varlamov was nails, and you need a veteran goaltender, and it's always nice to have a capable backup in Sorokin behind you, or at least interchangeable there. So if one has a bad night, you don't lose a step going to your next goaltender. So I was excited, and if you're an Islanders fan looking at this as a whole, I think your goaltending situation has you smiling ear to ear as you take on a offensive driven Tampa Bay team, even if there is a let up in net.
That's absolutely been an advantage that the Islanders have ridden through the first 2 rounds, as they should. Now, we talked about last week a little bit. What did we think of them switching back to Varlamov? And I personally agreed that was a good move. It made sense. Nothing changes in terms of Sorokin's status being the goalie of the future, but it was clear like they wouldn't have gotten this far without Varlamov, who had one of the best goalie seasons in the NHL, was narrowly outside of being a Vezina finalist in my eyes. So while Sorokin is more than capable of playing well in his absence, and he did. I still think Varlamov's the guy the Islanders have to ride with here as long as possible. And that switch made a lot more sense to me than the Fleury-Laner switch in Vegas as a comparison. But anyway, getting back to these last couple games here, there were a couple of qualities or tendencies that we saw from the Islanders, and they're the same ones that you're used to seeing, but I think they even turned it up a notch here in the third period, protecting leads in these games. So going back to game 4, tightly contested 1-1, Matt Barzal, ridiculous goal to give him a 2-1 lead. Couple empty netters eventually finished it off. But not only could Boston not get the equalizer, they couldn't even get any shots on goal. That theme continued in game 5, at least after the Islanders jumped out in front. Now, game 5 was kind of the exception. That was where Tuukka Rask had an off night. He was pulled after 2 periods, and the Islanders jumped out to, I think it was a 5-2 lead before Boston pulled within 1. But once Boston pulled it to 5-4, They had about 6, 7 minutes left on the clock, I believe. And I think they had one shot on goal. It was a defensive clinic from the Islanders who just, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. They
Yeah.
were standing them up at the blue line, chipping pucks out, killing more time. And it's perfectly reflective of how Barry Trotz wants the Islanders playing. They executed that game plan to a T. And in the game 6 tonight that finished about 30 minutes before we started recording, the Bruins were down 4-1 after 2 periods. The Islanders went on that barrage in the second to score 3 goals, and no spit, no lube, rough sandpaper finished them right out of the playoffs. And the last 16 minutes of the game for Boston, I think they had one shot on goal. They couldn't even get set up when they were down 2. They couldn't pull Tuukka until there were less than a minute and a half to go. So that defense was out of this world. We know it's the strength of their team, but they took it to another level in the last 3 games, and it's no coincidence that's they won the last 3.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that last point that you made there with tonight at the end of the game there. It seemed like, I mean, Boston was trying to get Tuukka off the ice. They put a goal in the third period to make it 4-2. And they're like, okay, we need to get Tuukka out of the net. We need to get that extra attacker with as much time as possible. Well, what do the Islanders do? They're back in the offensive zone, just basically playing 4 corners, just trying to keep the puck moving around so that Tuukka can't come out of the net. I mean, Boston's skating around looking like dogs out there, keeling over on their knees, just trying to keep up with this and at least get the puck out. I think there was one chance. I think it was Krejci that got it towards center ice, and it was about, like you said, the 120 mark of the period, and that's when Tuukka came off. They eventually capped it off and won the game. So, I mean, it's crazy how they can continually do this night after night, and especially as of late here in the postseason, because, I mean, when a strength becomes a bigger strength, that's going to be impossible to beat.
Yeah, and if you look at the Tim Duncan approach, where they try to turn their weaknesses into strengths, that's when we can look at the Islanders offensively a little bit. And while the offense was more than effective enough, in game 4 they really scored 2 goals with 2 empty netters. So it's not like you look at that one and say the offense won them the game. In game 5, it's a complete contrast. They were doubled up in shots. I want to say it was 40-19, 41-19 in favor of Boston. The Islanders scored 5 goals. Now, part of that is because Tuukka Rask had an off night. And another part of it is because they scored on their first 3 power play attempts. And that the Islanders have had a mediocre at best power play all season, but they really stepped up at a big moment for them to hold on in the third period, give them a series lead, second round in a row, go up 3-2 despite being outplayed in game 5, and then clinch the series in game 6 at home. It's a pretty good formula for them if it's going to keep working. And we can get into the officiating controversy here in a minute with a couple of the games in this series, but I don't want that to overshadow the accomplishment. The defensive hockey was an absolute clinic. The offense was opportunistic. They were efficient when they had their chances, despite getting outplayed at various points in the series. And I do want to mention really quick, I think it was in game 5, Barry Trotz did switch up the lines a little bit, moving Brock Nelson down to the third line and moving John Gabriel Pageau up to line 2 with Beauvillier and Bailey. And that paid off big time with a couple of goals from that line in the game.
Yeah, Brock Nelson scored tonight too. I mean, it's nice to get that production from your team. And I went on the record the other day and said I wanted Matthew Barzal to step up. I mean, this was before the Islanders sort of came back in the series. I guess you could say that it looked like Boston was controlling there for a little while in the series. But that's when I was like, I looked at the box score. I saw Barzal's got 4 assists in the postseason. I'm like, he didn't have a goal. I'm like, you got to put the puck in the back of the net. If you really want to step up and really want to be, you need your superstars on a team that doesn't have a lot of offensive firepower. You need Barzal to put the puck in the back of the net. He eventually did that, and it got everybody else going there. And Beauvillier played well. I mean, just they found a way to get it done, and that's what you need to do in the postseason. It's to survive an advanced approach, and hopefully they can survive taking on Tampa here soon.
Well, honestly, I hope they can. But it is absolutely the approach that serves them well. They were able to maximize everything they did well all series. So congratulations to them. I'm not to overshadow the accomplishment or anything, but I think we got to give our take here on the New York Saints advancing to the third round of the playoffs. And that's not me agreeing with Boston, by the way. That's just the thing that went viral, right? So Boston's a team complaining about the officiating, Islanders getting a couple extra power plays, et cetera, right? And I guarantee you the Islanders are going to use that Saints moniker as their kind of the rallying cry for the rest of their playoff run, however long it lasts. You remember like, the Yankees fan a few years ago who had like the
Yep.
thumbs
Yeah.
down and the Yankees did that whenever they got a hit for the rest of the year. They're going to embrace being the Saints, and they should. That's a rival team that they're trying to beat in a playoff series, giving them motivation that they didn't even need. So kudos to them for taking advantage. But I wanted to start the officiating talk. Back in Game 4, there was a play where David Krejci speared Matt Barzal in the corner, right in the nuts. No need to sugarcoat it. It was originally called a 5-minute major in a game misconduct, and after review, it was somehow changed to a 2-minute minor and nothing else. Did you happen to see the play?
I did. That was whenever I see anybody get hit in the nuggets, it really makes me just keel over and be like, oh man. And just to see the spear there, I mean, it looked like a 5-minute major at the very least. I mean, if you want to remove the game misconduct, I think maybe that's when you consider it. But when you bring it down to a minor penalty for spearing someone in the general direction, that doesn't feel too good. And it's definitely not the right call on the ice.
Well, well, you can't spear anybody at all. I mean, in the family of jewels is an even worse place to do it. But we're trying to get spearing out of the NHL, right? And I'm not. And there, part of the talk was that Barzal did have a cross check on David Krejci a few minutes earlier, and he absolutely did cross check him. And I do agree that those cross checks are usually let go. If you watch NHL games, you can see countless ones in various places on the ice, but especially either right in front of or right behind the net that are let go all the time. And I don't think that's right. I think more cross checks like the one Barzal had should be called generally, but it's not like the Islanders are the only ones to get away with this. And it feels weird defending them, but here we are. It's 2021. The Knicks made the playoffs, and I'm standing up for them. It's just, it still does not excuse Krejci spearing him regardless of where he gets speared. And it also doesn't excuse the NHL's joke of a replay system where you review that and somehow change it to a slashing minor. Slashing by definition, you chop down on somebody's stick. And when Krejci goes up into somebody, how the fuck do you call that a slash? Minor or major or what? How is that a slash? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, you look at the officials and what they call for a slashing penalty, they literally go like this. 2-minute slash, and they cut their arm in half, right? That's the signal for the penalty. He did not do that. He went he jabbed him. He gave him a little push there at the spearing direction. So it was definitely a rough call there. Cassidy ended up getting fined $25K for his comments after the game about the Saints stuff. So definitely a big choice there by the NHL, and of course Cassidy to open up his pie hole.
Well, I mean, it's Boston, and the players from both of these markets they better not be afraid to open their mouths, whether they're right or wrong. They're looking for that interaction in the media in New York and Boston. But and we want to advance it a little bit. So Game 5 is the game where afterwards Bruce Cassidy went on his big rant, and in that game, in fairness, they called Sean Corrali for a slash that didn't happen. That was a horrible call. I don't think anyone from either side will deny that, but there were a couple of pretty weak calls on both teams the rest of the way. So while I do think the officiating might have favored the Islanders a bit in Game 5, it still doesn't mean that it's a smart idea for Cassidy to go on that big rant against the officials. And then Barry Trotz, when he was asked about the calls and the Saints comments, he brought up a very accurate point. The Islanders don't get called for a lot of penalties, the fewest per game in the league, actually. And I believe Boston had the third most penalties per game. So I'm not saying, I'm not here to say that there was an agenda by the officials here. It kind of goes along with the season-long trends for these teams. Just one takes more penalties than the other. And Boston probably wouldn't be complaining so much if they didn't let a mediocre power play go 3 for 3 through 2 periods, right? The game would have been completely different. So I understand some of the frustration, but for the most part, I don't really think it was warranted. I know it sounds weird coming from me, but for the most part, I agree with the Islanders' side of this. Through the first 5 games of the series, the Islanders had 4 more power play opportunities total. That's not really that lopsided. And while there were a couple of bad calls, the Corrali one I thought was the worst in terms of minor penalties, ignoring the Barzal spearing incident. It definitely wasn't enough for me to be like, oh yeah, the Bruins have a legitimate beef here. I didn't see it like that at all.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily see it either there. But looking at the Islanders real quick on their side, you mentioned the penalties there. What that tells me is they're a team that, I mean, they're well coached. They're well coached. They're a Barry Trotz. I mean, they don't take a lot of penalties. It's not necessarily they're not getting called for some of them. It just so happened that there were some missed calls, but that was usually on the other side. So it's tough to tell right there with the calls that are happening against the Islanders. But I mean, they're such a structured team, not just defensively, but mentally. They're strong up there and they know exactly what they're going to do night in and night out. So to make this assumption that they're not getting calls, which might be true in that exact game, to pin it on the rest of the season, I don't think you can really make that accusation.
I don't think so either. It's a very disciplined team under a veteran coach. That's not surprising. It's a relatively older roster as well. Like this is mostly a veteran team. There are exceptions, of course, but we see that physical style really starting to take a toll throughout these series. And if the opponent has a game where they kind of play into the Islanders' hands by not being able to get any shots on goal. And if you give the Islanders 3 goals, that's usually a death sentence. It's really difficult to score and generate consistent offensive zone pressure against them. So kudos to them. They executed the game plan well. They were able to convert on their offensive opportunities. And I'm really, really interested to see what happens in the round against Tampa and going from there. But that'll be without question another tough task for them. But if frankly they had 2 tough tasks already in this playoffs and passed them, so I wouldn't put anything above them. They absolutely have the ability to keep advancing.
Yeah, that's going to bring me to my next point here before we get into the Nets. Just a quick little preview here in this Tampa Bay series. Tampa Bay, you mentioned the 3-goal leads, usually a death sentence. Tampa Bay can usually, I mean, their offense is legit. They got their guys back with they dodged the cap with Kucherov, Stamkos back. They have a legit offense. So, I mean, Killorn, there's so many guys you can go up and down the list that don't even get mentioned that can still put the puck in the back of the net. Probably better than anybody on the Islanders' first line. So you look at this Tampa Bay team, and they're legit offensively. And you got Hedman in the back. You got Sergachev. You have a lot of great defensive players back there, and you have a Vezina goaltender in Andrei Vasilevsky. So Tampa Bay is legit. Do you think that this structure that the Islanders have been running for so many years now will match up well against Tampa Bay, or do you think that they could get destroyed?
I think we're going to see a little bit of a balance there. There's going to be moments during the series where the Lightning offensively are going to be able to generate a few goals at a time. It's going to happen at some point, regardless, right? But there are also points for the Lightning offense is not going to be shut down, I don't think, but it can be slowed down long enough if the Islanders are able to jump out to even a 2-goal lead in one of these games, especially if it's in the third period of a game during the series. Now, the Lightning, like you mentioned, playing over the salary cap, they have the ridiculous offensive skill, but to me, it's Vasilevsky is going to be the main the biggest question. He has been lights out in this playoffs for the Lightning, and that shouldn't be a surprise. I think we also have to mention this is a rematch of a series we saw in the Eastern Conference Finals last year, and the Lightning won that one in 6 games, I believe. They are, if anything, healthier now. Stamkos did not play in that series last year. He came back for 1 shift in 1 game and scored a goal in the finals against Dallas. So pretty legendary stuff there. But these teams are familiar with each other. They have mostly similar rosters still intact, with limited exceptions, and they know each other's styles. They know what they want to do. The Lightning are the defending Cup champions, though, and the Islanders are going to want revenge, and they know where that target is.
Yeah, they do. And man, you know what this reminds me of? You mentioned the Vasilevsky being like legit. Like we all know that he's legit, and he's sort of overlooked on this team because there's so much firepower. It kind of reminds me of the Soviet Union hockey team where they have the great goaltender back there, and it sort of gets overlooked a little bit there with great goaltending. You think there's any sort of comparison there, or am I out of my mind?
Are we doing that like the Vladislav Tretiak 1980 Soviet team?
Yes.
Well, I don't think he got overlooked, but I definitely get what you're saying, considering all the NHL talent that was on that Soviet roster. But I don't. I think Vasilevsky is starting to get some of the recognition he deserves. The goaltending matchup is going to be one of the main selling points on TV for that Lightning Islanders series. It should be great. But I do expect there to be at least some offense at various points. Like as great as he is, we saw that crazy second period in one of the games against Carolina where both teams scored 4 goals. And I could see something like that happening in one of the games. Like it's not going to be a vanilla series. I have no doubt. I think it's going to be competitive. I think a couple of the games might be more the style the Islanders want to play, kind of low scoring, grind it out. And I think a couple others are going to be more in the style Tampa wants to play. I think both teams are way too talented to just get pushed over in 4 or 5 games. But hey, I've been wrong before. We've been wrong about the Canadians twice, and they're still playing. So who the hell knows? But I expect it to be a really, really interesting series. And I expect there to be a lot of emotion, especially in a rematch of last year.
Yeah, it should be very interesting. A great series there going forward. And speaking of a series that is basically the other way around, let's head over to the NBA and talk about the Nets. They're dominating right now, no doubt about it. They're playing Milwaukee. They're basically running them out of their own building on night after night. I mean, it's Kyrie, it's KD. They're stepping up. No Jeff Green, no James Harden, at least for the next game 3 here coming up. They said Jeff Green's probably going to be out game 4 as well. So this Nets team, I mean, they're finally, I mean, not necessarily finally, but they're putting it together. They're playing their best ball at the right time, and everybody's buying into what they're doing. So I'm loving with I'm loving this Nets team. What do you think?
They have been really impressive in the first 2 games of this series against the Bucks. Now, I expected Milwaukee to pose a bigger challenge than the Celtics did, but so far that has not been the case. And the Nets have thrived offensively despite the absence of Harden for all but like 1 minute of this series so far. And defensively, they haven't been impacted by Jeff Green's absence so far. They have done an outstanding job limiting the offensive output of Giannis Antetokounmpo. They've mostly just been clogging the paint and forcing him to stay outside as much as possible, which is a pretty good strategy. And more importantly, they've done a good job limiting the secondary guys of Chris Middleton, who was lights out first round against the Heat, and Drew Holiday, the huge offseason acquisition in Milwaukee. So that's their big 3. And they've all just not been anywhere near as effective. Neither of the first 2 games were competitive. And even with the series shifting back to Milwaukee, I haven't seen anything that leads me to believe that it's going to change too drastically, even if Harden and Green continue to be out.
Yeah, it's been crazy. I didn't think that we'd see. I thought it'd probably go 6, probably 6 games there, and the Nets would end up taking it. But either way, they're stepping up. They're playing well right now.
Continuing on with the Nets talk here, I'm going to finish up the show here myself. Dylan's having a few technical issues, but we definitely wanted to give the Nets a few more minutes of shine. They've absolutely deserved it with their dominant performance so far in these playoffs. And we talked about how they look like they're capable of rolling through the rest of this round and possibly rolling all the way to a championship. But just focusing on the first 2 games of this series, there were a couple other things that I wanted to bring up here before we signed off for the night. And briefly on last week's show, we talked about Bruce Brown being used as a small ball center and his usage. And if anything, that's been highlighted more with James Harden's absence. And I definitely want to give him an extra individual shout out this week. So Bruce Brown was brought in primarily to be a defensive guard who can guard multiple positions. And he's still doing that very effectively. But his offensive game is being taken up to another level. He's been a little bit unheralded. We talk about the stars, Irving, Durant. They've earned it, obviously. We talk about how important guys like Joe Harris are from the outside. But Bruce Brown, who is 6'4", is being used as the roll man in a pick and roll offense. And he is doing an unbelievable job in terms of scoring. I think he's at 1.2 points per possession, which is about league average for centers. And he's doing it at 6'4". I got that stat from an article on The Athletic, but I wanted to highlight that, how effective, how creative that's been in the Nets offense. And I'm really curious to see if this is a wave that we're going to see in the NBA going forward, where a smaller player is going to be used in the pick and roll that is effective with a floater game like Bruce Brown, that attacks the offensive glass like Bruce Brown and has that passing ability, yet still is able to play the perimeter defensively and did a great job limiting the effectiveness of Middleton and Holiday on Milwaukee in game 2. They only combined for 30 points and they weren't important ones. Chris Middleton was scoreless for most of the first half. And frankly, that game was over after the first quarter. So I want to give Steve Nash some credit too. He was definitely an out of left field hire a little bit for the Nets when they let Jacques Vaughn go after their short run in the bubble last year. Nash kind of came out of nowhere. He gets this team with a couple of superstars already that are coming back for the first time, in Durant's case, in a couple of seasons. Then they bring in James Harden about 6 weeks into the year, if that. And despite some occasional defensive lapses and weird games here and there, he has the Nets absolutely humming. And so far, he has outcoached Mike Budenholzer of Milwaukee. And I definitely thought he deserves a little bit of praise here as a first-year head coach. Obviously, he has a ton of talent on this roster to work with, where the absence of James Harden, frankly, doesn't even limit their offense. But the creativity with how Bruce Brown has been used in particular, the intelligence defensively, limiting Giannis, keeping him to the outside. He scored 15 points on 18 shots, I believe, in game 2. And if you're Brooklyn, you will take that any day of the week. And if they're able to continue that, even to a limited extent, they have the capability of sweeping their way by Milwaukee here. I'm not guaranteeing that, but we definitely agree that Brooklyn is likely to win this series relatively quickly, barring something catastrophic in the next couple of games. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted both of them out. And if they do get James Harden and Jeff Green back, that could only make them more dangerous on both ends of the court. So this is definitely a scary looking team. They looked more impressive in the first 2 games against Milwaukee than they did at times in the Boston series, where they even managed to lose one of the games. And I said last week, thought that was a wake-up call, and I think that's definitely helped them get firing on all cylinders here. They have an injury to one of their all-stars, and they don't even miss a beat. That's really, really impressive. So they're going to be a well-oiled machine. We'll see how the rest of this series goes. Game 3 of that series will be later tonight after this episode drops on Thursday afternoon. But since Dylan's got the technical difficulties, I'm going to wrap this up here. So the poll question of the week, we're going to have that on our Twitter page, the Big City Sports PD. Make sure to check that out. That poll question is just going to be, who do you think is going to win that series between the Islanders and the Tampa Bay Lightning? I think I'm going to pick the Lightning, but that might be wishful thinking on my part. I'm a little biased there. But please go over there and let us know what you think. Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well at the Big City Sports Pod. Post some teasers on there. We're on every platform in terms of YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Google Play, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to check us out there. And previewing next week here really quick, we're going to continue with the Nets and the Islanders talk in the playoffs. Both of them will guaranteed to still be playing by the time next week is recorded. So we'll continue to highlight their runs here. And we're also going to get back into baseball a little bit. It's been a while since we've talked about it, and we're going to do a little midseason update on the Yankees, Mets, Cubs, and White Sox, and do a little bit of a progress report here as we get closer to the All-Star break. But make sure to check us out on all platforms. Give us a like, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We could definitely use your support. Leave any comments or feedback on any of these videos. And for Dylan's technical issues, I'm Swig. We will be back next week. We'll see you next time. Have a good day, guys.